this morning in our epistle from Paul in his letters to the people of Corinth, he described us as earthen vessels. And, we talked about that this week at Bible study, and I've been sitting with that, and I really think, we think of earthen vessels as a clay pot, basically, and it's something that's fairly fragile. And so I wonder if that's not kind of a metaphor for the apostle to describe the fragility of human life and that contrast between the weakness of being a human being and the vast mightiness of God. And so we are simply earthen vessels being used for some purpose to some extent as we are here in the world. And so thinking about what would an earthen vessel, it's just a little clay pot. Well, it clearly is something that's fairly humble, right? It's not a fancy silver goblet. It's not something made of fine china. It's a humble piece of clay that's been fashioned, and it's usually not perfect because another human has fashioned it. If you've ever done pottery, it's hard to have it be exactly perfect, and no two are exactly alike, just like people. Like, they're very individual. And we're also dependent on God if we are earthen vessels. God is the one who offers us the power and the grace, and our lives are filled with purpose when we are allowing God to be in our lives, when we allow God to fill us in some way so that we can then be aware of God's presence in us and in the world. And we also are able to fulfill our purpose in the world when we live into whatever it is God is calling us to be. Just like we heard, Samuel was being called. And oftentimes it's hard for us to hear God's voice and to be aware of God's presence. For Samuel, it took 3 times in this story. And even then, he went to check with Eli, I'm not really sure what's going on. Are you calling me? It took Eli to absolutely name, yes, it is the Lord who's calling you. You need to say, here I am. And we often do that as well. We might hear a voice and then be not really sure that we've heard the voice or been aware of God, and we need it a couple of times. Sometimes people talk about that sense of intuition that comes up, but if something gets brought up to you maybe 3 times, you think, oh, okay, you're the 3rd person that's mentioned this to me. Maybe I do need to read that book. Maybe I do need to go visit that place. Maybe I do need to consider serving the world in this way, either as a career or another way. We seek to hear God in the world, and often we hear God in other people who come to us and affirm things. And also there's that piece of resilience, right? Yes, we are clay pots. We are fragile, and yet we know, even as life knocks us around, we tend to be able to put ourselves back together with help from God and community oftentimes, so that we can continue going, that we can still be instruments for spreading the gospel and the good news, even if we aren't perfect, we're a little chipped, or maybe parts of us have even broken off in the use and care of the world. And so one of the biggest reminders of the fragility of human life is remembering Jesus, joined us in his very fragile state, right? And was broken. His body was broken so that we all might have life. The perfect example of God understanding how fragile we are in this life, and yet God promising us that God is with us and that we will be okay ultimately, and that we are never alone. So I've been thinking about what are ways that maybe God does fill us as earthen vessels so that we are aware of God, and what then spills out of us that is of God because our vessels become so full. We use that metaphor as well of having a very full heart, or having a full spirit, or a mind that's full of God. And so I've been thinking love and compassion are things that often fill us, or strength, guidance, peace and serenity is something that might fill us. Joy and gratitude, that sense of knowing our purpose in the world and really living into that. And also that idea of community and connection, where we're really filled up by the being together, being in relationship with one another or with our family, and having that fullness to then go out and pour a bit of ourselves, a bit of God into the world. And so as we're moving through our days, what are ways that we can kind of pay attention? We may not hear God's voice as clearly as Samuel did. And so how can we listen for God and try to be present? And so one of the ways would be to go on a walk or to sit outside and just listen. Listen to the world around us, the birds, the wind, even the traffic or people walking by, and being aware of how God is touching and in all of those. And listening for the sounds that maybe we don't typically notice. Because, I don't know if you've ever had that experience where we'll go through a blackout and all the electricity turns off and suddenly it's like, oh, I didn't realize I'm so used to the constant hum of the refrigerator or whatever it is, that we're really not in silence very much, even when we're being quiet. And so what do we notice? We can also look for things like the blessings of the ordinary. So we are now in ordinary time, which is the church season between Pentecost and Christ the King Sunday. It lasts for about 6 months, and it's our longest season of the year. It's the time of year when we all better like green, because we're going to see a lot of green. And it really matches sort of the way our lives are as well. Ordinary is the way we mark most of our days. And so to me, there's a real interesting combination. We do have wonderful seasons in our lives. When something special happens, a new baby is born, we're celebrating a birthday, an anniversary, some big milestone in our lives, a graduation or something. And those seasons are really special. And most of the time, though, our days are ordinary. And so how do we continue to look for God in the ordinary times? How do we remember that just as we're seeing God showing up in the Gospels, in our lessons, in this place among us, whether it's Advent or Easter or Lent or ordinary time, how are we also honoring and recognizing and calling forth God in the world, even in the regular days of our lives? And that brings us to the gift of time that we heard about today, the Sabbath, the idea of the Sabbath that we heard from Mark's Gospel. We are in a very, they call it the grind culture, right? That we're just supposed to go, 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 go. And be productive, that you explain your worth by how tired you are and how much you've done and how long your to-do list still is, right? We really seem to honor that. Often when somebody says, "How are you?" the response is, "I'm tired," right? There's just some almost status in the fact that we are always hustling. And Sabbath actually means to cease or to stop. Sabbath is not about resting just long enough so you can work harder. Sabbath is about pausing and being filled and being present and recognizing that God is there. And how are we listening? How are we fostering these relationships in our lives that point to God, or that we then can use our lives to help point to God? And so really honoring the Sabbath, not because it's full of rules, like we heard from the Pharisees, but because God is in that space, because God has called rest good. That is one of the early commandments that we had in our faith tradition and all of the Abrahamic traditions, to rest and to remember that it is when we are quiet and still and seizing with the busyness of the world, we can be fully listening and present to however God shows up. I think it's not a coincidence that Samuel was sleeping as God was trying to get Samuel's attention, because often I think we ignore what's going on. And we also just need to be open to however things are appearing to us and to try and just show up as best we can, because that's life as well. We can have all sorts of plans. What's that expression? We make plans and God laughs, right? And we also have just this sense of being much more in control of our lives and our calendars than we really are. I've been going through that in the last, 6 or 7 months with my daughter being so ill. I had the illusion of what my life was going to look like with, kids in college and being newly married. I had this idea of what the world was going to be like, and it was all in my calendar. It was planned out, and that's not what happened. And that's the way life is, whether it's ordinary time or extraordinary time. We never quite know what's going to appear before us. And so the more we can think of ourselves as earthen vessels that are waiting to be filled and are already always filled by God's deep presence and abiding love, I think that's what can help sustain us. And that's what can help us pour into one another in the world when the world really needs us to. And so my question for you as we move into this next week and this season of ordinary time is, if we really are earthen vessels, if we really are fragile, humble beings, but who are so beloved by God, made of the dust and the clay of the earth, and precious, every one of us, like a grain of sand, then what are we doing to offer our vessels, offer ourselves to God and the world? Because we are needed just as sorely as we